Did Nebuchadnezzar meet Jesus? Reminder to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date on our Daniel series as new videos come out. Chapter 3 kicks off our second point in our chiasm that will be reflected again in Chapter 6. Chapter 3's focal point is on Daniel's three friends being delivered, which ultimately rests under the umbrella of God's sovereignty over the affairs of our lives. Chronologically, Daniel covers the whole Babylonian period. You can read more about this period in 4 other books. 2 Chronicles chapter 36 covers the whole period as well. 2 Kings chapters 24 and 25 covers Nebuchadnezzar's reign. The book of Jeremiah goes shortly after the fall of Jerusalem, and the book of Ezekiel covers roughly from 592 to 570 BC. Our 3 prophets bring to light different elements of this period as well. Daniel gives us the perspective of events from Babylon. Jeremiah writes of things taking place in Jerusalem, and Ezekiel writes while in exile outside of Jerusalem itself. Reading these together gives us a greater perspective on all the events. Altogether, we read about 3 sieges that Nebuchadnezzar laid on Jerusalem. The first one came in 605, jump-starting the exile period. The second one took place in 597 after King Jehoiakim tried to rebel and align himself with Egypt. And the third and final siege resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem and the first temple, which begins all the theories about where the Ark of the Covenant is now located. Dating chapters 3 and 4 as well is a little bit of a mystery. We know that they fall sometime during Nebuchadnezzar's reign, but when cannot be known for sure. Why didn't Daniel just put down some dates for chapters 3 and 4, as he did for chapters 1 and 2, and that he will do for chapters 7 through 12, as 12 is connected to 11. Interestingly, though, the translator of the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Old Testament, says that the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar in verse 1 was the year in which this should be dated. They associated with the destruction of Jerusalem in 587. So a different point that I would like to make out of this is that this is kind of similar to the whole dating of Jesus' birth and crucifixion. Luke told us that Jesus started his ministry in the 14th year of Tiberius, but he didn't connect any ruling year to Jesus' birth or his crucifixion. It's odd how much fighting can come from chronological debates on those dates, but it might be just part of God's purpose that it creates dialogue and research and the whole debate over the issue, so it gets people more interested in the Bible. Chapter 3, verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was of 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. It's interesting that this is the first event that Daniel records after he just got done interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue of multiple metals, in which in verse 238 he said that he, Nebuchadnezzar or Babylon, was the head of gold. And there's 3 descriptions of this gold statue of Nebuchadnezzar's that are found in verse 1 here. We see that it is an image of gold and not multiple metals, like we said, and its height is of 60 cubits, and its breadth is of 6 cubits. A quick point of internal evidence here for the early date is that the Babylonians used sexagesimal or base 60 counting, so again, it's just Daniel reflecting the Babylonian norms, and that it's another one of those indicators that a Jew 400 years later under Greek oppression would not stick these type of details into the book. Now, you might ask, what is a cubit? A cubit is the measured distance between a person's elbow and the tip of their middle finger. The average length of this is somewhere between 18 to 21 inches, and sometimes you hear about a royal cubit or an Egyptian cubit and so forth, but they're all between this range. What that tells us is that the height of this statue is at minimum 90 feet and has a width of 9 feet as well. The funny aspect of this statue is of its ratio of height to width being 10 to 1. Now the Statue of Liberty has a 3 to 1 ratio with a height of 111 feet 6 inches to 35 feet at its base. Nebuchadnezzar's statue isn't that much shorter than the Statue of Liberty, but its ratio tells us that this statue is oddly narrow in its appearance and wouldn't have a normal human look to it, but it possibly resembled more like an obelisk. Maybe it was made in haste and the height was the most important feature that they wanted to signify because it reached towards the heavens and it showed dominance towards everyone. But, this kind of makes sense because we all marvel at skyscrapers more than we do city malls. Why are these details included? Or maybe, what benefit do they serve us? Well, this is just another one of those details that let us know that this is coming from an eyewitness account and not somebody 400 years removed from the scene. In Herodotus' histories from the 5th century, he says, "There is moreover in the temple at Babylon another cell below, wherein is a great image of Zeus sitting, made of gold, and by its placed a large table of gold, and his footstool and the seat are of gold also, and as the Chaldeans reported, the weight of the gold of which these things are made is 800 talents. This statue of Zeus, or probably Baal, is said to weigh 800 talents. That would be, in today's measurements, 30 tons or 60,000 pounds. Now, is this an exaggeration? Who knows for sure? But he continues saying, "There was moreover in these precincts, still remaining at the time of Cyrus, a statue 12 cubits high, of gold and solid. This I did not see myself, but that which is related by the Chaldeans I relate." So Herodotus is saying that this is secondhand information that he is reporting with, but we are getting similar details to Nebuchadnezzar's statue of gold. What about the 60 cubits in height of the statue? Kind of seems a little absurd that these people back then could build such a statue, right? First, I would say that this is because often critics of the Bible want to attack the intelligence level of the people back then. People treat those people from biblical times as they were just superstitious or just dumb desert dwellers. Always keep in mind that the pyramids were built 2,000 years prior to this even taking place, and we still don't even know how they even did that. So don't let scoffers play that type of card at any time you're trying to debate with them. But on the height, there were statues of this magnitude built in antiquity. Most have heard of the Colossus of Rhodes statue that was 70 cubits high, or 30 feet taller than Nebuchadnezzar's statue of gold here, and it was erected on a port at sea. So why was the statue even built? We don't know if the statue resembled a human, or was it at all similar to his dream from chapter 2, but we know that it was made of gold and likely does have a connection with chapter 2 since we are working with the same author. So on our timeline, and taking into account the Septuagint declaring that this was the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, it does make good sense to think that this was erected after Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. Remembering that Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that God gave him his kingdom and power, and that he/Babylon was the head of gold on the statue, that this makes sense that possibly Nebuchadnezzar felt that the God of Israel, Yahweh, had just been defeated by his God after this destruction. Thus, erecting this fully gold statue is declaring that the Babylonian kingdom will stand forever. Even though Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged the God of Daniel as the one who gave Daniel the insight into his dream and the ability to interpret it, it didn't mean that Nebuchadnezzar just left all his gods behind and said, "All right, now I'm just going to worship the one true God who is Yahweh of Israel." So we should see these chapters 2 and 3 as laid out as being contrasted with one another. Verse 2. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors, and the captains, and the judges, the treasurers, and the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces, to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, and the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And then a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whoso falls not down and worships shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." The warning is simple. Either bow down and worship the statue, really the god of the statue, or be thrown in the burning fire and be burnt alive. So what's being done here is a test of loyalty. So the subjects of Babylon had to ultimately decide, whom do they fear more, God or man? Or to ask a deeper question, whom do you fear more? Jesus said, And I say unto you, my friends, be not afraid of them that kill the body, and after that have no more that they can do to you. He goes on saying to fear only God, because he ultimately has the authority over your eternal life, and not to stress over the little basics of things like food, clothing, or shelter. Luke 12 is one of those reality check chapters that we all need to read at some point and from time to time. The text also raises another question. When is it okay to disobey the government? Most of us will probably think of Romans 13, where Paul says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, because there is no authority except from God. The authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring damnation on themselves." This seems pretty straightforward, like we're just supposed to fall in line and do whatever the government tells us. But that's not the whole case, because Paul clarifies this in the next verse, saying to do what is good. So, the dividing line here is sin, like it always is. We obey the government, we follow the laws, and we pay our taxes. As long as the government is not demanding for us to sin, then we just accept the penalty that goes with that, which is no different than Jesus, the apostles, and the martyrs did under Roman rule. So, for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were not going to break the second commandment because God's law always outranks man's law. The last detail that I want to highlight before trekking through the rest of the story is that of the punishment of the burning fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar's punishment is not without external support. Jeremiah 29:22 acknowledges that Nebuchadnezzar did burn people alive. And in the Yale Babylonian collection, an inscription from Rinsim of Larsa says, "Because they threw a young slave into an oven, throw ye a slave into a furnace." And this is coming from the 18th century BC. So Nebuchadnezzar wasn't the originator of this type of punishment, but again, it's another internal reason for dating the book early. Because at some point, the critic will just have to say that his anonymous author was just that good to stay on spot with all these types of details that are reflecting cultures hundreds of years before his time. Verse 7. Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Wherefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree, that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falls not down and worships, that he should be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. This is actually a fulfillment of what Moses prophesied in Deuteronomy 4. He said, And the Lord shall scatter you among the nations, and you shall be left few in number among the heathen, and there you shall serve gods. This whole exile period was prophesied by Moses. He told the nation that they would fail to keep the law, and that they would fall into idolatry, but God would keep his end of the bargain by punishing them for their idolatry. Funny is that Moses asked them even if they wanted to agree to all these terms, and even though they knew that God would punish them, they still said yes. So the reality of this scene is that these guys were the only ones not willing to break the second commandment. Verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not you serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now if you be ready, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the image which I have made, well, but if you worship not, you shall be cast in the same hour in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Try to hear the arrogance here of Nebuchadnezzar over the God of Israel, because he is likely thinking back to the destruction of Jerusalem and that he won, and that most likely that God is no longer there to support them. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Gee, I wonder how he's going to take that type of response. But one thing to point out here is that Daniel is not mentioned here in the scene, nor is he mentioned at all in chapter 3. It raises a few questions like, was he there, but maybe he had an exemption from the king to bow down to the statue because of his earlier work for the king in chapter 2, but maybe he might have been out sick, or that he was out on an errand, as a government official to somewhere else. But the easiest thing that we can say is that it's highly unlikely that Daniel would have ever bowed down to this statue. Let's see the king's response. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spoke, and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than is recommended to be heated. The 7 times here is not a multiplicative description, like going from 100 degrees to 700 degrees, but more like he wanted it as hot as possible. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flames and the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So the thing here is that these men likely got the backdraft of the flames because of Nebuchadnezzar's demand and the note of the directional description of taking the boys up like on a ladder. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Gleason Archer commented on the construction of Mesopotamian smelting furnaces that matches the clear description that is laid out here in this event. So it's likely that the mighty men, or the guys from the army, were needed to carry Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up a ladder to throw them into an upper chamber, but then on their way down that they caught the backdraft, and that's what consumed them. So it's just another internal detail to accept the early date. The boys are literally in the fire and don't have very long to live. But let's see what comes next. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spoke, and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast 3 men bound in the midst of the fire? And they answered and said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Before thinking that the Son of God here is used in the Christian sense, it's good to see that other translations read, like a son of the gods, which reflects better his pagan polytheistic beliefs. But he is recognizing that the 4th figure is a divine being. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spoke and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. And the princes, governors, captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose body the fire had no power, nor was a hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of the fire had passed on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel, and had delivered his servants, that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own. Nebuchadnezzar is starting to catch on here that Yahweh really isn't defeated, and that he should stop messing with his chosen people. So he does the following. Therefore, I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Nebuchadnezzar is still not what we would call a believer in the one true God. He is likely just trying to prevent, as he calls it, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from coming after him and his kingdom. And the chapter closes with the following. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So who was the fourth person that freed the three friends? Before you just say, it was Jesus, try to put yourself in the context a little bit here. Jesus is not going to be born for another 500 years plus. So they just can't say, oh, it's our Messiah. So in the Old Testament thinking, who could this divine being be? Nebuchadnezzar actually gave us a few details. First, he described this being as a man, and so he could say that he looked human and no different than Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Next, he called him the Son of God, or the Son of the Gods. So this is recognizing that he is a divine being. Next, he called the three friends servants of the Most High God. Now that might not be directly about the fourth person, but it will help us out in a little bit. And the last thing he said was that the fourth person was an angel, or that he said it's God's angel. Now, if you don't know who this Old Testament figure is quite yet, then you need to stick with this because this dives directly into the doctrine of the Godhead. The figure here is most often referred in the Old Testament as the angel of the Lord or the angel of Yahweh. The phrase, the angel of the Lord, occurs 74 times in the Old Testament. There are many famous stories in which this figure shows up over and over again, helping the people of Israel. Another synonymous phrase for this figure is the angel of God. 7 times this exact wording is used and again shows up in famous scenes. We see these two phrases are speaking of the same figure because of the connection in Genesis 16 and 21 of Hagar and Ishmael, and that of Judges 6 and 13, the two phrases are used reflexively. So, the angel of the Lord and the angel of God are the same figure. But the story that I want to draw our attention to is with Moses and the burning bush. Now, if I was to ask you, who spoke to Moses out of the burning bush, I guarantee you 100% of the people would say, well, it was God. And that is correct, but there's a catch to that. Look at what the text says. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush, and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Verses 2 and 4 might give an impression that there are two different characters here, but we don't have two bushes. We have only one, with both the angel of the Lord and God are said to be in the midst of the bush. So the simple resolution to this is that the angel of the Lord is God. Now you might think, did I just go beyond what is being described here? But I'm really not, because in verse 6 it says, Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. The grammar here still places the angel as the one talking, yet the angel says he is the God of the patriarchs. This connection is solidified in Genesis 31:31 that reads, And the angel of God spoke unto me in a dream, saying, Jacob. And I said, Here I am. Hear the same thing that Moses said earlier? And he said, Lift up now thine eyes, and see, all the rams which leap upon the cattle are ring-straked, speckled, and grizzled, for I have seen all that Laban has done unto thee. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar, and where you made a vow unto me. Now arise, get thee out from this land, and return unto the land of thy kindred. The angel of God here is clearly saying that he is God. Right? Many believers have a hard time grasping the idea of the Godhead, let alone, where to point in the Bible that says, hey, there you go. That's how we know that there is a Godhead in heaven. But one place that does describe a Godhead on the scene for us is found in Genesis 19 with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. At the point of destruction, verse 24 says, Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. I included Yahweh here because it is how the Hebrew actually reads. Some versions honor this rather than substituting Lord in all caps for it. But what it does tell us is that there's two Yahwehs here on the scene, one on the ground and one in heaven. Now, if there's not a Godhead, then how did the Lord, who is on the ground, rain brimstone from the Lord, who is out of heaven? Remember, before this, that the Lord came with two angels to Abraham's tent. They ate, announced the birth of Isaac. All of this was done face to face in physical form. So, we have two persons here, both being described as Yahweh. One is in heaven, and the other one is visibly on the ground. So, there are two persons as Yahweh in verse 24. Yet, one God is described in verse 29 that says, "And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain." The Hebrew word here for God is Elohim, which is a plural, but is used in a singular sense for the one supreme God. And this is why we Trinitarians believe in a Godhead. It's right in our Bibles, and we just need to connect the dots and see the whole mosaic laid out in the Bible. So who was the fourth person in the fiery furnace? Well, we can say for sure that it was the angel of the Lord, or the angel of Yahweh, because of what we read in earlier scenes that matches the description found here in verses 25 through 28. But another way that we could describe this figure is by connecting verses 25 and 26 together by calling him the Son of the Most High God. So we know that this figure is still linked with the angel of Yahweh, but the phrase Son of the Most High God should be ringing some bells in our head because of a famous encounter in the New Testament. In Mark 5 and Luke 8, Jesus meets the Gadarene demoniac who describes himself as Legion, and he says the following to Jesus: "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" So there you go. There's our phrase, Son of the Most High God. So who was the fourth person that saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the flames? It was Jesus, who we know is the Son of the Most High God, who is the angel of the Lord from the Old Testament, who is God. Jesus was and is the visible Yahweh that showed up physically over and over again in the Old Testament to save his people, just like he did here with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and just like he did while he was in God incarnate here on earth in human form in the Gospels, and just like he still does today by living inside of us. He is the same God yesterday, today, and forever. Reminder to hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. In the meantime, stay salty.